Blackwells True Spirit. Washington, D.C., 1923. Rose Kensington had always known the shape of her own shadow. But tonight, as she walked past the street lamps, she noticed something unsettling. A second shadow stretched beside hers, broader, taller, wearing a soldier's cap. Captain Thomas Sinclair's cap. Chapter 1. The Shadow That Wasn't Hers. The gas lamps of Washington, D.C. hissed softly, casting a pale, flickering glow on the wet cobblestones. Rose Kensington pulled her shawl tighter, the November chill seeping into her bones despite the thick wool. It was 1923, 5 years since the armistice, but the city, like Rose herself, still carried the invisible scars of the Great War. She'd come to the capital seeking a fresh start, a place to bury the ghosts of France, but tonight, they seemed determined to follow. She'd spent the evening at a charity gala, a suffocating affair filled with brittle smiles and forced gaiety. The women, draped in the new, shorter fashions, spoke of jazz and flappers, but their eyes held a lingering sadness, a shared understanding of loss that no amount of rouge could conceal. The men, many in their tailored suits hiding the lingering effects of shrapnel or gas, talked of business and politics, their voices booming a little too loudly, as if trying to drown out the echoes of the trenches. Rose had played her part, smiling politely, offering the expected platitudes, but her heart felt like a lead weight in her chest. She'd excused herself early, claiming a headache, a common enough ailment in those days, often a polite euphemism for a soul weary of pretending. The crisp night air was a welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere of the ballroom. She walked briskly, her heels clicking a steady rhythm on the pavement, needing the physical exertion to quiet the turmoil within. It was then, as she passed a particularly bright street lamp near the newly built Lincoln Memorial, that she saw it. Her shadow, elongated and distorted by the angle of the light, stretched out before her. But beside it, a second shadow flickered, broader, taller, and distinctly male. The shape of the head was unmistakable, the slight tilt, the way it seemed to jut forward. It was the silhouette of a soldier's cap. Captain Thomas Sinclair's cap. Rose stopped dead, her breath catching in her throat. She glanced around, her heart pounding a frantic tattoo against her ribs. The street was deserted, the only other presence the rustling of the wind through the bare branches of the trees. There was no one there. Yet, the shadow remained, a dark, persistent companion. She slowly turned her head, examining the angle of the light, the shape of the nearby buildings, searching for any logical explanation. A trick of the light, perhaps? A peculiar architectural feature casting an odd projection? But her mind, trained in the meticulous observation of a nurse, found no such answers. The shadow was undeniably him. The phantom image mirrored her movements, a ghostly dance partner in the silent street. It was the way he used to stand, one shoulder slightly higher than the other, a result of an old injury sustained at Ypres. The way he held his head, a mixture of defiance and vulnerability that had always drawn her in. Rose had spent years trying to outrun the memory of Captain Thomas Sinclair. She'd buried herself in work, first in the chaotic field hospitals of France, and later in the quiet, sterile wards of a London veterans' hospital. She'd changed her name, subtly altering her maiden name of Rosalind to the simpler, less distinctive Rose. She'd even, for a brief, desperate period, considered marrying a kind, if somewhat dull, banker from Philadelphia, hoping that the normalcy of domestic life would finally silence the whispers in her heart. But nothing had worked. Thomas was a persistent ghost, woven into the fabric of her being. He was in the scent of rain on the earth, the sound of a distant train whistle, the bittersweet melody of a half-remembered song. And now he was in her shadow. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She leaned against the cold, rough stone of a nearby building, her hand clutching at the fabric of her coat. Was she losing her mind? Was this the final unraveling, the delayed consequence of the horror she had witnessed, the grief she had swallowed? She closed her eyes, taking deep, shaky breaths, trying to regain control. She was Rose Kensington, a practical, sensible woman. She did not believe in ghosts. She did not believe in shadows that defied logic. But when she opened her eyes, the second shadow was still there. A sudden, sharp memory pierced through the fog of her fear. A memory of a moonless night in France, the air thick with the smell of mud and blood. She was huddled in a makeshift operating tent, the flickering lamplight casting grotesque shadows on the canvas walls. Thomas, his face pale and drawn, his uniform stained with crimson, was lying on a stretcher, his hand reaching for hers. "Promise me," he'd whispered, his voice raspy and weak. "Promise me you'll live, Rose. Don't let this darkness consume you." She'd made that promise, her fingers intertwined with his, the warmth of his hand a fleeting comfort in the face of impending loss. She'd held on to that promise, clung to it like a lifeline, even as she watched the light fade from his eyes. But now, standing in the cold, deserted street, with his shadow stretching beside hers, she wondered if she had truly kept her word. Had she truly lived? Or had she merely existed, a ghost in her own life, haunted by the memory of a love that had been cut short by the cruel hand of war? The shadow shifted, as if in response to her thoughts. It seemed to lean closer, a silent offering of comfort, or perhaps a challenge. A challenge to finally face the past, to confront the secrets she had buried so deep, and to decide, once and for all, whether she was ready to truly live again. Or would she continue down this path, never knowing if the shadow beside her was a trick of the light or the man she lost so many years ago? The chill grew deeper, no longer just the November air, but a coldness that seeped from the very core of her being, a premonition of the journey ahead and the unsettling truth that awaited her. Chapter 2. Whispers in the War Memorial. The newly constructed Lincoln Memorial stood stark and imposing against the pre-dawn sky, a monument to a nation fractured and then painstakingly pieced back together. Rose found herself drawn to it the following morning, almost against her will. The image of the shadow, the impossible silhouette of Thomas, had clung to her throughout a restless night, driving away any semblance of sleep. She needed answers, or at least a semblance of rationality to cling to. The memorial was largely deserted at this early hour. A few groundskeepers swept the expansive steps, their brooms whispering against a stone, the sound oddly amplified in the stillness. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of the Potomac River and the faintest hint of wood smoke from distant chimneys. Rose climbed the steps slowly, her legs feeling heavy, her mind still reeling from the previous night's encounter. Inside, the colossal statue of Lincoln gazed down with a somber, melancholic expression. Rose had always found a strange comfort in his presence, a sense of shared sorrow, perhaps, or a recognition of the immense burden of leadership in times of conflict. She sat on one of the benches lining the walls, her gaze fixed on the statue's face, searching for some sign, some indication of what? She wasn't even sure. The silence of the memorial was broken only by the occasional cough or the muffled sound of footsteps. Rose closed her eyes, trying to shut out the external world, to focus on the internal chaos that threatened to consume her. "Thomas," she whispered, the name a barely audible sigh. "Was it you? Was it really you?" Of course, there was no answer. Only the echoing silence of the vast chamber. But as she sat there, a memory surfaced, unbidden and unexpectedly vivid. It was a conversation she and Thomas had had, just weeks before his death. They were sitting in a small, relatively quiet cafe in a French village, a rare respite from the constant barrage of the front lines. "Do you ever think about what happens after?" Thomas had asked, his voice unusually serious. He was staring into his coffee cup, the dark liquid reflecting the flickering candlelight. Rose had hesitated. She wasn't particularly religious, not in the conventional sense. Her faith had been shaken, if not shattered, by the relentless suffering she had witnessed. "I don't know," she'd admitted. I hope there's some peace, at least." Thomas had nodded slowly. "I believe there is," he'd said, his gaze meeting hers. "I believe that love, true love, transcends even death, that it leaves a mark, an echo, something that can't be erased." He'd reached across the table and taken her hand, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. I believe that if we're meant to be together, we'll find a way, even if it's in the shadows. The memory hit her with the force of a physical blow. In the shadows. Could it be possible? Could his words, spoken with such conviction, have held a deeper meaning, a prophetic truth that she was only now beginning to grasp? Rose stood up abruptly, her heart pounding. She walked towards the wall of the memorial, her fingers tracing the engraved words of the Gettysburg Address. 47 years ago, the familiar words, etched in stone, seemed to vibrate with a new resonance, a reminder of the enduring power of words, of promises of love. She noticed a small, almost imperceptible crack in the wall, near the base of one of the massive columns. It was barely visible, a hairline fracture in the otherwise flawless surface. But as she looked closer, she saw something tucked into the crack, a small, folded piece of paper. Curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of unease, compelled her to reach out. She carefully extracted the paper, her fingers trembling slightly. It was old and brittle, the edges frayed and discolored. She unfolded it slowly, revealing a single, handwritten sentence. The clock tower holds the key. The handwriting was unfamiliar, a hurried scrawl that seemed to pulse with urgency. Rose stared at the message, her mind racing. What clock tower? What key? Was this some kind of elaborate prank? Or was it connected, somehow, to the shadow, to Thomas? A wave of frustration washed over her. She felt like she was caught in a maze, surrounded by cryptic clues and half-formed memories, with no clear path to follow. But beneath the frustration, a flicker of determination ignited. She wouldn't be dismissed. She wouldn't be deterred. She would find the clock tower. She would find a key. She would find the truth, no matter how painful, how improbable it might be. She was getting closer. She could feel it, a vibration in the air, a pull. She followed out the heavy doors. She just had to find out what it all meant. The rising sun cast long shadows across the steps of the memorial, and for a fleeting moment, Rose thought she saw it again, the faintest outline of a soldier's cap, just beside her own. But this time, she wasn't afraid. This time, she was determined to follow. This time, she felt his presence in her shadow, and it guided her forward. Chapter 3. The Unsent Letter. The clock tower could refer to a dozen places in Washington, D.C. Rose considered the old post office pavilion, with its prominent clock, but dismissed it. It felt too obvious. The note implied something hidden, something requiring more effort to uncover. She spent the morning wandering through the city, her eyes scanning the skyline, searching for a less conspicuous candidate. She visited the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, even the National Cathedral, each time feeling a growing sense of discouragement. As the afternoon wore on, exhaustion began to set in. She found herself back near her small boarding house, a modest establishment on a quiet street lined with elm trees. Mrs. Davison, her landlady, a kind, matronly woman with a keen eye for observation, noticed Rose's weary expression. "You look troubled, dear," Mrs. Davison said, her voice laced with concern. "Anything I can help with?" Rose hesitated. She was reluctant to share her strange experiences with anyone, fearing ridicule or, worse, pity. But Mrs. Davison had always been a source of comfort, a steady presence in her otherwise unsettled life. I've been looking for something," Rose admitted vaguely. "A clock tower. But I'm not sure which one." Mrs. Davison chuckled softly. "Well, that's a broad search, isn't it? There are quite a few clock towers in the city. Do you have any other clues?" Rose hesitated again, then decided to take a chance. She described the note, the cryptic message, the feeling that it was connected to something important. Mrs. Davison listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. "A key, you say? And the handwriting was unfamiliar?" She paused, tapping a finger against her chin. "You know, there's a small clock tower on the old War Department building. It's not used much anymore, mostly storage. But it's got a fascinating history. During the war, it was a central hub for communications. All sorts of messages passed through there, coded and otherwise." Rose's heart skipped a beat. The War Department building. It felt right. A place of secrets, of hidden messages, of wartime connections. Could I get inside? Mrs. Davison smiled. I have a friend who works in the archives there. He might be able to arrange a visit. It's mostly restricted access these days, but for a good cause she winked. I'll make a call. An hour later, Rose found herself standing in front of the imposing War Department building, a sense of nervous anticipation churning in her stomach. Mrs. Davison's friend, a Mr. Henderson, a small, bespectacled man with a gentle demeanor, met her at the entrance. Mrs. Davison speaks highly of you, Miss Kensington, Mr. Henderson said, his voice a soft whisper. She says you have a particular interest in the clock tower. Rose nodded, trying to maintain a calm composure. I believe there might be something important there. Mr. Henderson led her through a maze of corridors, the air thick with the smell of old paper and dust. The building felt like a relic of a bygone era, a silent witness to countless decisions that had shaped the course of history. They reached a narrow, winding staircase, leading upwards. The clock tower is at the top, Mr. Henderson said. Be careful. The steps are quite steep. Rose climbed the stairs, her hand gripping the cold iron railing. The air grew colder, the silence more profound. She reached a small, wooden door, its surface scarred and weathered. Mr. Henderson produced a large, antique key, its metal tarnished with age. He inserted it into the lock, the mechanism turning with a loud click. The door creaked open, revealing a small, circular room. The clock mechanism, a complex network of gears and levers, dominated the space, its rhythmic ticking filling the silence. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight filtering through the grimy windows. Rose scanned the room, her eyes searching for anything that might resemble a key. There were shelves filled with old ledgers and documents, a few discarded chairs, and a large, wooden chest tucked into a corner. She approached the chest, her heart pounding. It was locked, but the lock was old and rusty. She tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Frustration welled up inside her. Was this another dead end? Then she noticed something. A small, almost imperceptible inscription on the side of the chest, near the lock. It was a series of letters and numbers. T.S. 1918 A.F. Thomas Sinclair. 1918, American Expeditionary Forces. It was his. The chest belonged to him. A surge of emotion, a mixture of grief and excitement, washed over her. She felt a desperate need to open the chest, to uncover whatever secrets it held. Mr. Henderson, who had been observing her quietly, stepped forward. I might have something that can help, he said. He produced a small, metal pick from his pocket, a tool he used for repairing old locks. He carefully inserted it into the lock of the chest, his fingers working with practiced precision. After a few tense moments, the lock clicked open. Rose lifted the heavy lid, her hands trembling. Inside, nestled among layers of faded velvet, were several items, a worn leather-bound journal, a small, silver locket, and a stack of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. Rose reached for the letters, her fingers brushing against the brittle paper. The top letter was addressed to her, in Thomas's familiar handwriting. But it was unsent. The envelope was sealed, the ink faded but still legible. She recognized the date, the address, but more importantly, the feeling in her chest, tight and restricted, like that letter. She was not meant to see it. It was dated just days before his death. The weight of the unsent letter, the unspoken words, the lost opportunities, pressed down on her. She felt a tear roll down her cheek, a single drop of grief for a love that had been snatched away too soon. But within that sorrow it held a spark of something else. A flicker of hope. A realization. The shadow was a memory, yes, but more. A presence, his promise, a faint echo leading her here. She held the answers. She held his last words. She needed a moment, and began to unfold the letter with care. Chapter 4. A Ghost in the Gallery. Rose couldn't bring herself to open the letter there, in the dusty, cramped clock tower. The weight of its potential contents, the anticipated surge of emotion, was too much to bear in that confined space. She carefully placed the letter, along with the journal and locket, back into the chest, thanking Mr. Henderson profusely for his assistance. He, sensing the depth of her emotion, simply nodded, offering a gentle smile and a promise of discretion. Back in her room at the boarding house, Rose locked the door, drew the curtains, and lit a small lamp on her bedside table. The soft glow illuminated the room, casting long shadows on the walls, but this time, she didn't flinch. She felt a strange sense of calm, a certainty that she was on the right path, however painful it might be. She sat on the bed, the chest resting on her lap. She opened it again, her fingers tracing the worn leather of the journal, the smooth silver of the locket. She decided to start with the locket. It opened easily, revealing 2 miniature portraits. One was of Thomas, his handsome face smiling, his eyes full of life and laughter. The other was of her, a younger version of herself, her hair still long and flowing, her expression a mixture of innocence and determination. It was a picture she had given him before he shipped out, a token of her affection, a promise of a future that never came to be. She closed the locket, holding it tightly in her hand, a tangible link to the past, to the love she had lost. Then, she picked up the journal. It was small and compact, the pages filled with Thomas's neat, precise handwriting. She began to read, slowly, savoring each word, each memory. The journal entries chronicled his experiences in the war, the horrors he had witnessed, the camaraderie he had shared with his fellow soldiers. He wrote of the mud and the blood, the constant fear, and the fleeting moments of beauty. He wrote of his longing for home, for peace, for her. Rose read for hours, tears streaming down her face, her heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and love. She learned things about Thomas she had never known, his secret fears, his hidden dreams, his unwavering belief in a better future. She felt closer to him than she had ever felt, even when he was alive. As she neared the end of the journal, she found an entry that made her heart stop. It was dated just a week before his death. "I've discovered something dangerous. Something that could change the course of the war, or perhaps even destroy it from within. I can't write the details here, it's too risky. But I've entrusted the information to a friend. Someone I trust implicitly. If anything happens to me, Rose must find him. He holds the key. The key." The same phrase from the note in the memorial. Rose's mind raced. Who was this friend? Where was he now? And what was the dangerous information Thomas had discovered? The following day, Rose decided to visit the National Gallery of Art. Thomas had mentioned in his journal that he often went there during his brief periods of leave in Paris, finding solace in the beauty of the paintings. He had a particular fondness for the Impressionists, their vibrant colors and fleeting moments of light offering a stark contrast to the grim realities of the war. Rose wandered through the galleries, her eyes scanning the paintings, searching for some connection, some clue. She felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if she had walked these halls before, perhaps in a dream, or in a past life. She stopped in front of a painting by Monet, a vibrant depiction of water lilies, their delicate petals shimmering in the sunlight. She remembered Thomas describing this painting in his journal, how it reminded him of her beauty, her resilience, her ability to find light even in the darkest of times. As she stood there, lost in thought, she noticed a man standing nearby, also gazing at the painting. He was tall and slender, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes. He wore a well-tailored suit, but there was something about him, a subtle air of melancholy, that reminded her of Thomas. He turned to her, a slight smile playing on his lips. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice soft and cultured. Rose nodded, her heart pounding. "Yes, it is. A friend of mine used to love this painting." The man's eyes widened slightly. "A friend?" he asked, his voice laced with a hint of curiosity. Rose hesitated, then decided to take a chance. His name was Thomas Sinclair. He was a captain in the American Expeditionary Forces. The man's expression changed, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even fear, crossing his face. "Thomas Sinclair?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. I knew him. Rose felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was the friend Thomas had mentioned in his journal. He entrusted you with something, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Something important. The man looked around nervously, as if checking to see if they were being observed. We can't talk here, he said, his voice low and urgent. Meet me tomorrow, at the same time, by the fountain in the courtyard. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Rose standing there, her mind reeling. She felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She was finally close to uncovering the truth, but she also sensed that she was stepping into a dangerous game, a world of secrets and betrayals, where the stakes were higher than she could possibly imagine. A world that was starting to bleed into her own. And she saw him. Just for a split second. Behind a pillar. A flicker. Thomas. Chapter 5. The Captain's Portrait. The fountain in the courtyard of the National Gallery was a tranquil oasis, a welcome respite from the bustling city outside. Rose arrived early, her nerves on edge, her mind replaying the brief, cryptic encounter from the previous day. The man, who she now believed to be Thomas's confidant, had seemed genuinely alarmed, his reaction suggesting that the something important was indeed significant and potentially dangerous. She sat on the edge of the fountain, watching the water cascade down the sculpted figures, the sound a soothing counterpoint to the frantic beat of her heart. She clutched the small, silver locket, her thumb rubbing the smooth surface, drawing strength from the image of Thomas within. He arrived precisely on time, his gaze sweeping the courtyard, his expression cautious. He sat beside her, maintaining a discreet distance, as if wary of being seen together. You said you knew Thomas Sinclair, Rose began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Yes, he replied, his voice low. We served together. I was his aide-de-camp. He paused, choosing his words carefully. My name is Arthur Fairchild. Rose nodded. Thomas mentioned a friend in his journal. Someone he trusted with a vital piece of information. Fairchild's eyes met hers, a flicker of understanding, and perhaps a hint of sadness, crossing his face. He did. And he was right to trust me. But he was also right to be cautious. What he discovered, he trailed off, shaking his head. It could have changed everything. What was it? Rose pressed, her voice barely a whisper. What did he find? Fairchild hesitated, glancing around again, ensuring they were not being overheard. There was a leak, he said, his voice barely audible. Someone within the Allied command was passing information to the enemy. High-level intelligence, troop movements, strategic plans, everything. Rose gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. A traitor. At the highest levels of command. It was unthinkable. But who? Fairchild shook his head. Thomas didn't know. He had suspicions, but no concrete proof. He was gathering evidence, trying to identify the source. He was close, very close. And that's why he was killed, Rose said, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't an accident, a random shell, a stray bullet. He was murdered. Silenced. Fairchild nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of grief and anger. I believe so. He was getting too close to the truth. Someone wanted him out of the way. And the information, the evidence, what happened to it? Fairchild reached into his coat pocket and produced a small, folded piece of paper. It was similar to the one Rose had found in the memorial, old and brittle, the edges frayed. This is all he had time to give me, he said. He told me to keep it safe, to deliver it to the right person if anything happened to him. Rose took the paper, her hands trembling. She unfolded it carefully, revealing another handwritten message, this time in Thomas's familiar script. The portrait holds the answer. Look beneath the surface. The portrait. Another cryptic clue. Rose felt a surge of frustration, but also a renewed determination. She wouldn't give up. She owed it to Thomas, to his memory, to his sacrifice. What portrait? She asked, her voice pleading. Do you know what he meant? Fairchild hesitated. I am not sure. He never specified. But he did mention spending time at the National Gallery admiring the paintings. Perhaps it's here. A sudden thought struck Rose. The way Fairchild had been looking at the Monet painting, the way he had spoken of Thomas, could it be? The water lilies, she said, her voice filled with a sudden conviction. The Monet painting. He loved that painting. He wrote about it in his journal. Fairchild's eyes widened.
It's possible, he said.
It's worth a try. They returned to the gallery, their footsteps echoing in the vast halls. They stood before the Monet painting, their eyes scanning the surface, searching for anything unusual, any hidden detail. Rose noticed something. A small, almost imperceptible irregularity in the canvas, near the lower right corner. It looked like a slight bulge, as if something was hidden beneath the surface. She reached out, her fingers gently pressing against the canvas. She felt something hard, a small, rectangular object. There's something here, she said, her voice trembling with excitement. Fairchild looked around nervously. We can't do anything here, he said. Too many people. Too many eyes. They left the gallery, their minds racing. They needed a safe place, a private place, where they could examine the painting without attracting attention. Rose thought of her room at the boarding house, but it felt too risky. Mrs. Davison was kind, but she was also curious. Then, she remembered the old War Department building, the clock tower. It was deserted, secluded, and it held a connection to Thomas. She needed to get back to that painting. She glanced down at her shadow, and a faint secondary figure seemed to lean forward with her, urging her and giving her the courage to do the unthinkable. She would return tonight. Chapter 6. Rain on the Potomac. The rain started just as Rose and Fairchild reached the War Department building. It was a heavy, relentless downpour, the kind that seemed to soak through to the bone in a matter of minutes. The streets were deserted, the city shrouded in a gray, watery mist. The imposing building loomed before them, its dark windows like vacant eyes staring out into the storm. Fairchild, using his connections, had managed to secure a key to the building and, more importantly, after hours access to the gallery. The guard, a grizzled veteran with a knowing look, simply nodded as they passed, offering a silent acknowledgement of their clandestine mission. The building was even more eerie at night, the silence broken only by the echoing sound of their footsteps and the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the windows. They made their way to the gallery, their flashlights casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The Monet painting, bathed in the soft glow of the emergency lighting, seemed to take on a new dimension in the darkness. The water lilies appeared to float on a sea of shadows, their vibrant colors muted, their beauty tinged with a sense of mystery. Rose carefully removed the painting from the wall, her hands trembling with a mixture of anticipation and fear. Fairchild held the flashlight, his beam focused on the back of the canvas. They found it quickly. A small, rectangular section of the canvas had been carefully cut and then reattached, almost seamlessly. Rose used a small knife, borrowed from Fairchild, to gently pry open the seam. Inside, nestled between the canvas and the wooden frame, was a thin, leather-bound packet. Rose carefully extracted it, her heart pounding in her chest. She opened the packet, revealing several documents, photographs, letters, and a detailed, handwritten report. The report was Thomas's. It was a meticulous account of his investigation, his suspicions, his evidence. He had identified the traitor, General Alastair Fitzwilliam, a highly decorated officer, a trusted member of the Allied command, a man who had been secretly working for the enemy. Rose gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. General Fitzwilliam. It was unbelievable. He was a national hero, a celebrated figure, a man who had been lauded for his bravery and his strategic brilliance. The photographs were even more damning. They showed Fitzwilliam meeting with known German agents, exchanging documents, sharing information. The letters, written in Fitzwilliam's own hand, detailed his betrayal, his motives, his plans. It was all there. The proof. The irrefutable evidence of Fitzwilliam's treachery. He did it, Rose whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and horror. Thomas found him. Fairchild nodded, his expression grim. He did. And he paid the ultimate price for it. A sudden noise, A loud crash from somewhere in the building startled them. They exchanged a nervous glance. Had they been discovered? "We need to get out of here," Fairchild said, his voice urgent.
"Now."
They quickly gathered the documents, carefully placing them back into the packet. Rose reattached the painting to the wall, trying to make it look as undisturbed as possible. They made their way back through the darkened corridors, their footsteps echoing eerily. The rain was still pounding against the windows, the wind howling like a banshee. As they reached the main entrance, they saw him, General Fitzwilliam. He was standing there, blocking their path, his face contorted with rage, a pistol in his hand. "You shouldn't have done that," Fitzwilliam said, his voice cold and menacing. "You shouldn't have interfered." Rose and Fairchild froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. They were trapped, cornered. The rain continued to fall, a relentless torrent, washing away the dirt and grime of the city, but also, perhaps, washing away the secrets, the lies, the betrayals. The Potomac River, swollen with the downpour, flowed nearby, a dark, powerful current, carrying everything away, towards the sea, towards oblivion. But tonight, it would carry a reckoning. Fitzwilliam raised his gun, his eyes locked with Rose's. Chapter 7. The Seance and the Secret. Before Fitzwilliam could pull the trigger, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the guard, the grizzled veteran who had let them in. He had his own weapon drawn, aimed squarely at Fitzwilliam. "Drop the gun, General," the guard said, his voice firm and unwavering. "It's over." Fitzwilliam hesitated, his eyes darting between the guard and Rose, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He slowly lowered his pistol, his hand trembling. "You don't understand," Fitzwilliam said, his voice pleading. "I did it for my country. I did it to save lives." "You betrayed your country," Rose said, her voice filled with righteous anger. "You betrayed Thomas. You betrayed everyone who fought and died for freedom." The guard stepped forward, disarming Fitzwilliam and handcuffing him. "I'll call the authorities," he said. "You two get out of here."
"Go."
Rose and Fairchild didn't need to be told twice. They fled the building, running through the rain-soaked streets, their hearts pounding, their minds reeling. They found refuge in a small, all-night diner, the only place open at that late hour. They sat in a booth, huddled together, shivering from the cold and the shock. Rose clutched the packet containing the evidence, her fingers tracing the outline of the documents within. "What are we going to do?" Fairchild asked, his voice weary. "We can't go to the authorities. Fitzwilliam has powerful friends. They'll bury this. They'll protect him." Rose thought for a moment, her mind racing. She remembered something Mrs. Davison had told her, a casual remark about a friend who was sensitive. A medium. Someone who claimed to be able to communicate with the dead. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. But Rose felt she had no other choice. She needed help. She needed guidance. She needed Thomas. "There's someone I need to see," she said, her voice firm. "Someone who might be able to help us." The following evening, Rose found herself in a dimly lit parlor, the air thick with the scent of incense and candles. Madame Evangeline, a flamboyant woman with flowing robes and a dramatic flair, sat across from her, her eyes closed, her hands resting on a small, round table. "I understand you seek answers," Madame Evangeline said, her voice a theatrical whisper. "You seek to communicate with one who has passed beyond the veil." Rose nodded, her heart pounding. His name was Thomas Sinclair. He was a captain, he died in the war. Madame Evangeline began to chant, her voice rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence. The room grew colder, the shadows deeper. Rose felt a strange sensation, a tingling in her fingertips, a pressure in her chest. "He is here," Madame Evangeline said, her voice trembling. "He is troubled. He seeks justice. He seeks revelation." Rose leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the medium's face. Tell him, we found the evidence. Tell him we know the truth." Madame Evangeline's body began to shake, her head swaying back and forth. "He says the diary, the missing page, the diary. Thomas's journal." Rose had read it cover to cover, but she hadn't noticed any missing pages. "What missing page?" Rose asked, her voice urgent. Madame Evangeline's eyes snapped open, her gaze fixed on Rose. "The last page torn out hidden, it contains the final piece, the name. The name of someone Fitzwilliam was working with. Someone even more powerful, even more dangerous." Madame Evangeline slumped back in her chair, exhausted, her face pale. "He is gone," she said, her voice weak. "But he has shown you the way." Rose left the séance, her mind buzzing with a mixture of excitement and fear. The missing page. She had to find it. It was the key to unlocking the final secret, to exposing the full extent of Fitzwilliam's conspiracy. She knew she was close, so close, but now, with the knowledge of another, even more sinister player, the stakes were even higher. The room faded, but a single word echoed from the séance. Ambassador. Chapter 8. A familiar face in the crowd. Rose returned to her room, the word ambassador echoing in her mind. The missing page from Thomas's journal, it had to be connected. She retrieved the journal from the chest, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. She examined it carefully, scrutinizing every detail, every crease, every tear. And then she saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible line near the binding, at the very end of the journal. It was the telltale sign of a page that had been carefully ripped out. She felt a surge of adrenaline. She was right. There was a missing page. And it contained the final piece of the puzzle, the name of Fitzwilliam's accomplice. But where was it? She searched her room, turning everything upside down, looking in every drawer, every box, every possible hiding place. Nothing. Frustration began to mount. She felt so close, yet so far. She had the journal, she knew the page existed, but she couldn't find it. She decided to retrace her steps, to revisit the places she had been since finding the chest. She went back to the War Department building, to the clock tower, retracing her every move, searching every nook and cranny. Still nothing. She was about to give up, to succumb to despair, when she remembered the locket. The small, silver locket she had found in the chest, along with the journal and the unsent letter. She had been so focused on the journal and the letter that she had almost forgotten about the locket. She had opened it, admired the portraits of Thomas and herself, but she hadn't examined it closely. She retrieved the locket from her purse, her fingers fumbling with the clasp. She opened it again, gazing at the two miniature portraits. And then she saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible gap between the back of one of the portraits and the lining of the locket. She carefully pried open the back of the portrait, her heart pounding in her chest. And there it was. Folded neatly, tucked away in the secret compartment, was the missing page from Thomas's journal. She unfolded it, her hands trembling so violently that she could barely read the words. But there it was, in Thomas's familiar handwriting, a single name, Ambassador Charles Worthington. Ambassador Worthington. The British ambassador to the United States. A man of immense power and influence, a trusted ally, a close friend of the president. It was even more shocking than Fitzwilliam. Rose felt a chill run down her spine. This was bigger, much bigger, than she had ever imagined. A conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government, a betrayal that threatened the very foundations of the Allied alliance. She knew she had to be careful. She couldn't go to the authorities, not yet. Worthington was too powerful, too well connected. She needed more evidence, something irrefutable, something that would expose him beyond any shadow of a doubt. She decided to attend a reception at the British Embassy, a lavish affair hosted by Ambassador Worthington himself. She needed to see him, to observe him, to gather any information she could. She borrowed a dress from Mrs. Davison, a stunning gown of emerald green silk, and spent hours preparing herself, transforming herself from a quiet, unassuming nurse into a sophisticated, confident woman. The reception was a dazzling display of wealth and power. The ballroom was filled with diplomats, politicians, socialites, all vying for the ambassador's attention. Rose moved through the crowd, her senses on high alert, observing everything, listening to every conversation. She saw him, Ambassador Worthington, standing in a corner, surrounded by a group of admirers. He was a tall, distinguished-looking man, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He exuded charm and charisma, a master of diplomacy, a man who could make anyone feel like the most important person in the room. As Rose watched him, she noticed something familiar. A gesture, a mannerism, a way of holding his head. It was the same as the shadow. The shadow she had seen that first night, the shadow that had led her on this perilous journey. A sudden realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't Thomas. It wasn't his ghost. It was Worthington. He had been there that night, watching her, following her. He knew. He knew about the letter, about the journal, about everything. And the familiarity she'd attributed to Thomas was a trick of the light, a projection of her own grief and longing onto a stranger. He was there to retrieve the lost information from Thomas before she found it. The shadow, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the crowded room. A flicker of recognition, of surprise, crossed his face. And then a cold, calculating smile. He knew that she knew. The game was on. Chapter 9. The Dance of Deception. Rose maintained her composure, returning Worthington's smile with a carefully crafted mask of polite interest. She knew she was walking a tightrope. One wrong move could expose her, put her in immediate danger. She had to play the game, to pretend she was just another guest, another admirer of the charming ambassador. She slowly made her way towards him, weaving through the crowd, her heart pounding in her chest. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, her hand trembling slightly. She needed to appear calm, collected, in control. "Ambassador Worthington," she said, her voice steady and clear as she approached him. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Worthington turned to her, his smile widening, his eyes assessing her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "The pleasure is all mine, Miss Kensington," Rose supplied, offering her hand. "Rose Kensington." He took her hand, his grip firm and slightly lingering. "Miss Kensington. A lovely name. Are you enjoying the reception?" "Very much," Rose replied, her voice betraying none of the turmoil she felt inside. "It's a beautiful evening." They engaged in polite conversation, a carefully choreographed dance of words, each of them probing, testing, searching for an advantage. Rose spoke of her fictitious travels, her interest in art, her admiration for the British culture. Worthington responded with charm and wit, his words carefully chosen, his demeanor impeccable. But beneath the surface, Rose sensed a tension, a hidden agenda. She noticed the way his eyes constantly scanned the room, as if looking for someone or something. She noticed the subtle gestures, the slight hesitations, the carefully guarded expressions. She decided to take a risk, to push him, to see how he would react. "I was so sorry to hear about General Fitzwilliam," she said, her voice laced with feigned sympathy. "Such a tragedy. He was a great man." Worthington's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes," he replied, his voice carefully controlled. "A great loss. He will be missed." "I understand he was a close friend of yours," Rose continued, her gaze unwavering. "We were acquainted," Worthington replied, his voice evasive. "We served together during the war. I believe my late friend Captain Thomas Sinclair also knew General Fitzwilliam," Rose said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Worthington's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face paled, his eyes widened, his hand tightened around his glass. He had clearly not expected her to mention Thomas's name. "Captain Sinclair?" he repeated, his voice barely audible. I don't recall he died in France," Rose continued, her voice relentless. "He was a brave man. He uncovered a great deal." Worthington recovered quickly, regaining his composure, his smile returning, but this time it was strained, forced. "I'm sure he was," he said, his voice tight. "Many brave men died in that war. It was a terrible time." He abruptly changed the subject, steering the conversation back to safer territory, but Rose had seen enough. She had confirmed her suspicions.
He was involved. He was guilty.
As the evening wore on, Rose continued to observe Worthington, watching his interactions with other guests, listening to his conversations. She noticed a pattern, a subtle exchange of glances, a brief, coded message passed between him and a man she recognized as a high-ranking official in the War Department. She realized that Worthington wasn't acting alone. He was part of a larger network, a conspiracy that extended far beyond Fitzwilliam. She needed to find out who else was involved, how deep the corruption ran. As she was about to leave the reception, Worthington approached her again, his expression serious. "Miss Kensington," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I believe we have more to discuss. Perhaps we could meet privately?" Rose knew it was a trap, a dangerous invitation, but she also knew she couldn't refuse. She had to play along, to get closer to him, to uncover the full truth. "I would be delighted, Ambassador," she replied, her voice calm and steady.
"Where and when?"
He gave her an address, a discreet location, a time the following day. "Until then," he said, his smile returning, but this time it was cold, menacing, a predator's smile. Rose left the reception, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She knew she was walking into a dangerous trap, but she also knew she had no other choice. She was committed to this path, to exposing the truth, to avenging Thomas's death, to bringing the traitors to justice. She was playing his game, but she had an advantage, a secret weapon, his guilt, and her determination. Chapter 10. The Telegram from France. The address Worthington had given her was a small, unassuming townhouse in a quiet, residential neighborhood. Rose arrived promptly at the appointed time, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. She was dressed simply, inconspicuously, a plain dress and a coat, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She carried a small, leather handbag containing a few essential items, a notepad, a pen, and a small, discreet pistol, a relic from her nursing days in France. A stern-faced butler answered the door, his expression unreadable. He led her through a dimly lit hallway, the air thick with the scent of old wood and polish. He showed her into a small, elegantly furnished study, the walls lined with bookshelves, a fire crackling in the hearth. Worthington was waiting for her, standing by the window, his back to the room. He turned as she entered, his expression a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. "Miss Kensington," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "Thank you for coming." "Ambassador," Rose replied, her voice steady and clear. "You said you wanted to talk." He gestured towards a pair of armchairs near the fire.
"Please sit down."
They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Rose studied Worthington's face, searching for any sign of weakness, any crack in his carefully constructed facade. "You mentioned Captain Sinclair," Worthington began, his voice low and deliberate. "You seem to know a great deal about him." "I knew him well," Rose replied, her gaze unwavering. "He was a dear friend." "And you believe he was murdered?" Worthington asked, his eyes probing hers. "I do," Rose replied, her voice firm. "And I believe you know why." Worthington sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "This is a dangerous game you're playing, Miss Kensington," he said. "You're meddling in affairs that are far beyond your understanding." "I understand enough," Rose replied, her voice cold. "I understand that you and General Fitzwilliam were traitors. That you betrayed your country, your allies, your own men." Worthington's face hardened, his eyes narrowing. "You have no proof," he said, his voice tight. "I have Thomas's journal," Rose replied. "I have the missing page. I have the evidence." Worthington's expression changed, a flicker of fear crossing his face. He had underestimated her. He had thought she was just a naive, grieving woman, easily manipulated, easily dismissed. "The journal, the page, it's circumstantial," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "It proves nothing." "It proves enough," Rose replied. "And I have more. I have witnesses. I have connections." It was a bluff, a desperate gamble, but she had to try. She had to make him believe she was more powerful, more informed than she actually was. Worthington stood up, pacing the room, his hands clasped behind his back. He was clearly rattled, his composure shaken. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice strained. "I want the truth," Rose replied. "I want justice. I want you to confess, to expose your accomplices, to pay for your crimes." Worthington stopped pacing, turning to face her, his expression a mixture of anger and desperation. "That's impossible," he said. "It would destroy everything. It would ruin me, ruin my country, ruin the alliance." "It's already ruined," Rose replied, her voice rising. "By your lies, your betrayals, your greed." Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The butler entered, his face pale, his hand trembling. He held a small, folded piece of paper. "A telegram, sir," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "From France." Worthington snatched the telegram from the butler's hand, his eyes scanning the message. His face drained of color, his body swaying slightly. "What is it?" Rose asked, her voice filled with a sudden, chilling premonition. Worthington looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of horror and disbelief. It's from the French authorities," he said, his voice barely audible. They've exhumed Captain Sinclair's body." Rose gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Exhumed?
But why?"
"They found something," Worthington continued, his voice trembling. "Something unexpected. Something that changes everything." He handed her the telegram, his hand shaking so violently that he could barely hold it. Rose took the telegram, her eyes scanning the message, her mind racing. The telegram was brief, concise, and devastating. Exhumation complete. Identity confirmed. Captain Thomas Sinclair alive. Rose stared at the words, her mind unable to comprehend their meaning. Alive? Thomas was alive? It was impossible. She had seen him die. She had held his hand as he took his last breath. The room began to spin, the walls closing in on her. She felt a wave of dizziness, of nausea, of overwhelming disbelief. It was a lie, a cruel hoax, a fabrication. It had to be. But what if it wasn't? The shadow, the letter, the journal, the telegram. It was too much. Everything she thought she knew, everything she had believed, was shattered. The world tilted. And she fainted. Chapter 11. The Hidden Diary. Rose awoke to the smell of ammonia, a sharp, pungent odor that stung her nostrils. She was lying on a sofa, a damp cloth on her forehead, Worthington hovering over her, his expression a mixture of concern and something else. Relief? "Are you all right, Miss Kensington?" he asked, his voice strained. Rose sat up slowly, her head throbbing, her mind still reeling from the shock of the telegram. "Thomas alive?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. It's not possible." Worthington avoided her gaze, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I don't know what to believe," he said, his voice evasive. It's a mistake. It has to be." But Rose knew, deep down, that it wasn't a mistake. The telegram, the exhumation, the confirmation, it was too specific, too detailed, to be a coincidence. She stood up, her legs shaky, her body trembling. "I need to go to France," she said, her voice firm. "I need to see for myself." Worthington hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, as if searching for an escape. That's not necessary," he said. "I can handle this. I can make inquiries. I can get to the bottom of this." "No," Rose replied, her voice rising. "I need to go. I need to see him. I need to know the truth." She turned to leave, but Worthington grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't be a fool, Miss Kensington," he said, his voice low and menacing. "This is bigger than you. This is bigger than Sinclair. This is about national security, about the balance of power. You can't interfere." Rose pulled her arm free, her eyes blazing with anger. "I'm not afraid of you, Ambassador," she said. "I'm not afraid of your threats. I'm going to France. And I'm going to find out the truth, no matter what it takes." She left the townhouse, slamming the door behind her, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She knew she was walking into a dangerous situation, that Worthington would do everything in his power to stop her, but she didn't care. She had to see Thomas. She had to know if he was truly alive. She went straight to the shipping company, booking passage on the next available vessel to France. It was a slow cargo ship, but it was the fastest option. She had a few days to wait, a few days to prepare, a few days to wonder, to hope, to fear. During those agonizing days, Rose decided to re-examine Thomas's journal, searching for any clue, any hint that might shed light on his supposed death, on his possible survival. She had read it countless times, but she had always focused on the entries related to the conspiracy, to Fitzwilliam, to the missing page. This time, she read it with a different perspective, a different focus. She looked for anything unusual, anything that didn't quite fit, anything that might have been overlooked. And then she found it. A small, almost imperceptible notation in the margin of one of the pages, a series of numbers and letters. RD.
VA.
17.8. She stared at the notation, her mind racing. What did it mean? It wasn't a date. It wasn't a code she recognized. It was something else. She remembered something Thomas had told her, a casual remark about his love of puzzles, of riddles, of hidden meanings. He had always enjoyed challenging her, testing her intellect, leaving her cryptic clues to decipher. Could this be another one of his puzzles? A message, a hidden message, meant only for her? She spent hours poring over the notation, trying to decipher its meaning. She tried different combinations, different interpretations, different approaches. And then it clicked.
RD.
Rose Davison. Her landlady.
VA.
Veterans Administration. The government agency that dealt with veterans affairs. 17.8 room number? File number? It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but she had to try. She went to Mrs. Davison's apartment, her heart pounding in her chest. Mrs. Davison, she said, her voice trembling. I need your help. I need to know, did Thomas ever leave anything with you? Anything at all? Mrs. Davison looked at her strangely, her brow furrowed in confusion. Thomas? But he's dead, dear. You told me yourself. I know, Rose replied, her voice urgent. But please, just think. Did he ever give you anything? A letter? A package? Anything? Mrs. Davison hesitated, her eyes searching Rose's face. There was something, she said slowly. A long time ago, before he died. He asked me to keep it safe, to give it only to you if anything happened to him. Rose's heart leaped with hope. What was it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Davison went to a small, antique chest in the corner of her room. She opened it, retrieving a small, leather-bound diary. He said it was important, Mrs. Davison said, handing the diary to Rose. He said it contained secrets. Rose took the diary, her hands trembling. It was another journal, a hidden diary, a secret record of Thomas's thoughts, his fears, his plans. The final piece of the puzzle, the final message. And a chilling entry awaited her, near the back, dated only days before he supposedly died. The plan is in motion. They will believe I am dead. Chapter 12. Betrayal at the Embassy. Rose read the hidden diary with a mixture of astonishment and growing horror. Thomas had faked his own death. He had orchestrated an elaborate deception, a plan to infiltrate the enemy, to uncover the conspiracy from within. He had known that he was getting too close, that his life was in danger. He had anticipated Fitzwilliam's betrayal, Worthington's involvement, the vast network of corruption that threatened to undermine the Allied war effort. He had chosen to disappear, to become a ghost, to work in the shadows, to gather the evidence he needed to expose the traitors. He had entrusted the key to his plan, the hidden diary, to Mrs. Davison, knowing that she would keep it safe, that she would deliver it to Rose, if and when the time was right. The diary detailed his plan, his contacts, his movements, his discoveries. He had assumed a new identity, a French resistance fighter, working undercover, gathering intelligence, sabotaging enemy operations. He had been living a double life, a dangerous game of cat and mouse, risking everything to bring down the conspiracy. And he had succeeded. He had gathered the final piece of evidence, the proof he needed to expose Worthington and his accomplices. But he had also made a terrible mistake. He had underestimated the reach of the conspiracy, the depth of the betrayal. He had been discovered. He was being hunted. The last entry in the diary was chilling. They know. They're coming for me. I have to disappear again. The entry ended abruptly, unfinished. The ink smeared, as if he had been interrupted or captured. Rose felt a cold dread creep over her. Thomas was alive, but he was in danger, grave danger. She had to find him. She had to warn him. She had to help him. She knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed help, someone she could trust, someone with the resources and the connections to navigate the treacherous world of international espionage. She thought of Arthur Fairchild, Thomas's aide-de-camp, the man she had met at the National Gallery. He had seemed genuinely loyal to Thomas, genuinely concerned about his fate. She decided to contact him, to share the contents of the hidden diary, to enlist his help. She sent him a telegram, a coded message, arranging a meeting at a discreet location. Fairchild arrived promptly, his expression a mixture of surprise and apprehension. Rose showed him the diary, explaining everything, revealing Thomas's plan, his discoveries, his danger. Fairchild listened intently, his face growing pale, his eyes widening in disbelief. "He's alive?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But how?" "He faked his death," Rose replied. "He had to. It was the only way to survive, to continue his work." Fairchild shook his head, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the deception. "This changes everything," he said. "We have to help him. We have to get him out of there." They decided to go to the American embassy, to seek the assistance of the military attaché, Colonel Davis, a man Fairchild knew and trusted. They believed that Davis, a loyal and patriotic officer, would be appalled by Worthington's betrayal, would be willing to help them expose the conspiracy. They arrived at the embassy, their hearts pounding, their minds racing. They were ushered into Colonel Davis's office, a spacious, well-appointed room, adorned with flags and military insignia. Colonel Davis, a tall, imposing man with a stern demeanor, greeted them warmly, inviting them to sit down. Fairchild explained the situation, presenting the hidden diary, revealing Thomas's plan, his discoveries, his danger. Davis listened intently, his expression growing increasingly grave, his eyes hardening with anger. "This is outrageous," he said, his voice filled with disgust. "Worthington a traitor? It's unbelievable." He examined the diary, scrutinizing the entries, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This is damning evidence," he said. "We have to act. We have to expose him, bring him to justice." He reached for the telephone, intending to call the authorities, to alert the president, to initiate an investigation. But before he could dial, Fairchild pulled out a pistol, pointing it directly at Rose. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Colonel," Fairchild said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. Rose gasped, her eyes widening in horror, her mind reeling in disbelief. "Fairchild? A traitor?"
It couldn't be.
He had seemed so loyal, so concerned, so genuine. "Arthur, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Fairchild smiled, a cruel, mocking smile. "I'm sorry, Rose," he said, "but you know too much. You've become a liability." Davis lunged for Fairchild, attempting to disarm him, but Fairchild was too quick. He fired the pistol, the shot echoing through the room. Davis slumped to the floor, his body lifeless. Fairchild turned the gun towards Rose, his finger tightening on the trigger. "It's over, Rose," he said. "You should have stayed out of this." He smiled. He was the one who wrote the note in the memorial. The clock tower, the gallery, all a carefully constructed deception. And she walked right into it. Chapter 13. The Scarred Soldier. Before Fairchild could fire, the door to the office burst open, and a figure stormed in. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the uniform of a French soldier. His face was partially obscured by shadows, but Rose recognized him instantly. The way he moved, the way he held himself, the intensity of his gaze. "Thomas?" she whispered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and hope. The man stepped into the light, revealing his face. It was Thomas, but he was different. Older, harder, his face bearing the scars of battle, of hardship, of a life lived on the edge. A long, jagged scar ran down his left cheek, a permanent reminder of his ordeal. But his eyes, those familiar blue eyes, were the same, filled with a mixture of love, concern, and determination. "Rose," he said, his voice rough but gentle. "Are you all right?" Rose nodded, tears streaming down her face, her heart overflowing with a mixture of relief and joy. He was alive. He was here. He had come for her. Fairchild, stunned by Thomas's sudden appearance, momentarily lowered his guard. It was the opportunity Thomas needed. He lunged at Fairchild, tackling him to the ground, the pistol flying from his hand. They wrestled fiercely, a desperate struggle for control. Thomas, despite his injuries, his years of hardship, was stronger, more determined. He overpowered Fairchild, pinning him to the floor, his arm twisted behind his back. "You were supposed to be dead," Fairchild gasped, his voice filled with pain and disbelief. "I had other plans," Thomas replied, his voice cold and hard. Rose retrieved the pistol, pointing it at Fairchild, her hand trembling but firm. She had never held a gun before, never intended to, but she would do whatever it took to protect Thomas, to protect herself. The sound of sirens filled the air, growing closer, louder. The authorities, alerted by the gunshot, were on their way. Thomas secured Fairchild, tying his hands with a length of rope he found in the office. He then turned to Rose, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice gentle. Rose shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered.
I'm just so happy to see you."
They embraced, a long, tight embrace, a reunion of two souls who had been separated by war, by deception, by death itself. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy, a moment of triumph over adversity, a moment of love reborn. The police arrived, taking Fairchild into custody, securing the scene, launching an investigation. Thomas and Rose were questioned, their statements corroborated by the evidence found in the hidden diary, by the documents recovered from the War Department building, by the telegram from France. Worthington was arrested, his diplomatic immunity revoked, his conspiracy exposed. The full extent of his betrayal, his network of accomplices, was gradually uncovered, leading to a series of arrests, trials, and convictions. The world was shocked by the revelations, by the scale of the deception, by the audacity of the traitors. But amidst the chaos, the outrage, the disbelief, there was a sense of relief, of justice served, of a wrong finally righted. Thomas, cleared of all charges, his true identity restored, his bravery and his sacrifice recognized, was hailed as a hero. But he shunned the accolades, the attention, the public acclaim. He had no desire for fame or glory. He had only one desire, to be with Rose. He looked at her, his scarred face softened by a tender smile. He was ready for a new life, a new war rebuilding what had been shattered. And she was, too. A shared trauma, a shared victory. Their looks intertwined. He gently stroked her cheek. Chapter 14. Flight from the Truth. The immediate aftermath of the embassy confrontation was a whirlwind of activity. Police interrogations, medical examinations, and the constant barrage of reporters vying for a statement made it impossible for Rose and Thomas to have a moment alone. Thomas, though cleared of any wrongdoing, was still technically a soldier, subject to military regulations. He was ordered to remain in Washington for further debriefing and to assist with the ongoing investigation. Rose, overwhelmed by the events of the past few weeks and the sheer emotional exhaustion, felt a desperate need to escape, to process everything that had happened, to find some semblance of peace. She couldn't face the endless questions, the prying eyes, the constant reminders of the trauma she had endured. She needed time to heal, to reconnect with herself, to figure out what her future held, with or without Thomas. She decided to leave Washington, to return to the quiet familiarity of her life before the shadow, before the conspiracy, before the world had turned upside down. She didn't tell Thomas of her plans, fearing his reaction, knowing that he would try to stop her. She left him a note, a brief, inadequate explanation, promising to return, but unsure when or if she ever would. She took a train south, heading towards a small, coastal town in Virginia, a place she had visited once, years ago, a place that held a memory of peace, of tranquility, of a life untouched by war and betrayal. She found a small cottage to rent, overlooking the ocean, a simple, rustic dwelling, far removed from the grandeur of Washington, from the intrigue of the embassy, from the shadow of the conspiracy. She spent her days walking on the beach, listening to the waves, breathing in the salty air, trying to find some solace in the vastness of the ocean, in the timeless rhythm of the tides. She tried to forget, to erase the memories of the past few weeks, to push Thomas from her mind, but it was impossible. He was everywhere, in the wind, in the waves, in the cry of the seagulls. He was in her heart, in her soul, in her very being. She realized that she couldn't escape, that she couldn't run away from the truth, from her feelings, from her love for him. She had been through too much, endured too much, to simply walk away. She began to write, pouring out her thoughts, her feelings, her fears, her hopes, onto the pages of a new journal. She wrote of her childhood, her dreams, her aspirations, her life before the war. She wrote of her experiences as a nurse, the horrors she had witnessed, the suffering she had endured, the resilience she had found. She wrote of Thomas, of their first meeting, their fleeting moments of happiness, their shared passion, their love that had been cut short by the war, and then, miraculously, restored. She wrote of his bravery, his sacrifice, his unwavering commitment to justice, his love for her. She wrote of her fears, her doubts, her uncertainties about the future. Could she truly trust him? Could she ever forgive him for faking his death, for leaving her to grieve, for putting her through so much pain? Could she ever truly move on from the trauma, from the betrayal, from the constant threat of danger? As she wrote, she began to heal, to understand, to forgive. She realized that Thomas had done what he had to do, that he had made the ultimate sacrifice, risking everything to protect his country, to protect her. He had not intended to hurt her, to deceive her, but he had been forced to make impossible choices, to live a lie, to become someone else. She realized that she loved him, more than ever, that she needed him, that she wanted to be with him, to build a future with him, a future free from shadows, free from secrets, free from fear. She decided to return to him. But another part of her, damaged and betrayed, wondered if it was even possible. She wrote and wrote until the pages blurred, until the ink ran dry, until she realized she had no choice. She had to trust him again. She packed her bag, bought a train ticket. Chapter 15. Reunion in the Ruins. Rose decided not to return to Washington. She knew that the city, with its memories and its lingering dangers, would be too much for her, too much for them. She needed a neutral ground, a place where they could start anew, where they could rebuild their relationship, free from the shadows of the past. She sent Thomas a telegram, a simple message, asking him to meet her in France, in the small village where they had first met, the village that held both beautiful and heartbreaking memories. She chose the village church, a partially destroyed structure, a symbol of both the devastation of war and the enduring power of hope. She arrived in the village a few days later, the journey a blur of anxious anticipation and lingering doubt. The village was much as she remembered it, quiet, peaceful, bearing the scars of war but slowly recovering, rebuilding, healing. The villagers, recognizing her from her time as a nurse, greeted her warmly, offering their condolences for Thomas's death and their astonishment at his miraculous resurrection. She went to the church, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands trembling. It was a ruin, its roof partially collapsed, its walls scarred by shrapnel, its windows shattered. But it still stood, a testament to resilience, to faith, to the enduring human spirit. She waited inside, sitting on a broken pew, the silence broken only by the wind whistling through the shattered windows and the occasional cry of a bird. She waited for hours, her anxiety growing with each passing moment. Had he received her telegram? Had he changed his mind? Had he decided that she was too much trouble, too damaged, too broken? As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ruined church, she heard footsteps. She turned, her heart leaping into her throat. It was him, Thomas. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the fading light, his figure tall and imposing, his face bearing the scars of battle, of hardship, of a life lived on the edge. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love, concern, and uncertainty. They stood there for a long moment, neither of them speaking, their eyes locked, their hearts communicating in a language that transcended words. The years, the distance, the deception, the pain, it all faded away, replaced by the simple, undeniable truth of their love. He walked towards her, slowly, hesitantly, as if afraid that she might disappear, that she might be a figment of his imagination, a ghost from the past. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the contours of her face, as if reassuring himself that she was real, that she was there. "Rose," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You came." "I did," she replied, her voice trembling. "I had to." They embraced, a long, tight embrace, a reunion of two souls who had been separated by war, by deception, by death itself. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy, a moment of triumph over adversity, a moment of love reborn, a moment of forgiveness, of understanding, of healing. They sat together on the broken pew, talking for hours, sharing their experiences, their fears, their hopes, their dreams. Thomas explained everything, his reasons for faking his death, his plan to infiltrate the enemy, his struggles, his sacrifices, his unwavering commitment to justice. Rose listened, her heart aching for him, for the pain he had endured, for the loneliness he had suffered, for the burden he had carried. She understood, she forgave, she loved. They talked about the future, about their plans, about their dreams. They decided to leave the past behind, to start anew, to build a life together, a life free from shadows, free from secrets, free from fear. They would stay in France, at least for a while, away from the prying eyes of the world, away from the lingering dangers of the conspiracy. They would find a small cottage, a peaceful place, where they could heal, where they could rebuild, where they could love. As the darkness fell, they lit a candle, its flickering flame illuminating the ruined church, casting dancing shadows on the walls. But this time, the shadows held no fear, no menace, no deception. They were simply shadows, a reminder of the past, but also a promise of the future, a future they would face, together. He took her hand. The candlelight flickered. They did not flinch. Chapter 16. The Price of Silence. Their peaceful existence in the French countryside was a balm to their wounded souls. They rented a small, stone cottage nestled in the hills overlooking the village, surrounded by fields of lavender and vineyards. They spent their days gardening, reading, walking, and simply enjoying each other's company. They slowly began to heal, to rebuild their trust, to rediscover the simple joys of life. But the past, like a persistent shadow, was not so easily dismissed. The conspiracy, though exposed and dismantled, still cast a long shadow over their lives. Worthington, awaiting trial in the United States, had powerful allies, influential friends who were determined to silence him, to prevent him from revealing the full extent of their involvement. One evening, as Rose and Thomas were sitting by the fire, enjoying a quiet dinner, they received a visitor. It was a man they had never seen before, a stranger with a cold, calculating gaze and a menacing demeanor. He introduced himself as Monsieur Dubois, a representative of certain interested parties. "We understand that you have information," Dubois said, his voice smooth and oily. "Information that could be damaging to certain individuals." Thomas stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for the small pistol he kept hidden beneath a cushion. "We have nothing to say," he replied, his voice cold and hard. Dubois smiled, a cruel, mocking smile. "I believe you do," he said. "And we are prepared to compensate you for your silence. Handsomely." Rose felt a chill run down her spine. This was a threat, a veiled attempt at bribery, a warning that they were still in danger. "We are not interested in your money," Rose said, her voice firm and unwavering. "We have already told the authorities everything we know." Du Bois's smile faded, his eyes narrowing.
"That was unwise," he said.
"Very unwise. You have made powerful enemies, Monsieur E.T. Madame Sinclair. Enemies who are not afraid to eliminate those who stand in their way." He turned to leave, his parting words hanging in the air like a poisonous cloud. "Think carefully about your decision," he said. "Your lives depend on it." After Du Bois left, Rose and Thomas sat in silence, the fire crackling in the hearth, the shadows dancing on the walls. They knew that they were in grave danger, that Worthington's allies were not going to give up easily. "We have to leave," Rose said, her voice trembling. "We have to disappear again." Thomas shook his head.
"No," he said.
"We can't keep running. We can't keep hiding. We have to fight. We have to expose them, once and for all." He had a plan. He had been working on it for weeks, ever since he had realized that the conspiracy was even larger, even more deeply rooted than he had initially thought. He had been gathering evidence, making contacts, preparing for a final showdown. He had discovered that Worthington's network extended far beyond the military, far beyond the diplomatic corps. It reached into the highest levels of the French government, into the very heart of the establishment. He had identified the key players, the masterminds behind the conspiracy, the men who were pulling the strings, manipulating events, controlling the flow of information. He had gathered enough evidence to bring them down, to expose their treachery, to destroy their power. But it was a dangerous plan, a risky gamble, a move that could cost them their lives. "It's too dangerous," Rose said, her voice filled with fear. "We can't do this. We can't risk it." Thomas took her hand, his eyes filled with love and determination. "We have to," he said. "We owe it to ourselves, to our country, to the memory of those who died because of their greed, their ambition, their betrayal." He looked into her eyes. He knew the risk, but he also knew the reward. Freedom. And they had to choose to fight for it. Together. He held her gaze. The fire crackled. They knew the price, but also knew it had to be paid. Chapter 17. A confession in the chapel. Thomas's plan involved a daring act of public exposure. He had discovered that several high-ranking French officials, implicated in Worthington's conspiracy, were scheduled to attend a memorial service at the very church where he and Rose had reunited the ruined church in the village. It was a symbolic choice, a deliberate act of defiance, a way to confront the traitors on their own ground. He arranged for a clandestine meeting with a trusted journalist, a man known for his integrity and his unwavering commitment to truth. He provided the journalist with the evidence he had gathered, the documents, the photographs, the names, the details of the conspiracy. He instructed the journalist to publish the story, to expose the traitors, to reveal their crimes to the world. The memorial service was a somber affair, attended by dignitaries, politicians, military officers, and members of the local community. The ruined church, a testament to the devastation of war, served as a poignant backdrop for the ceremony. Rose and Thomas attended the service, mingling with the crowd, their presence unnoticed, their intentions hidden. They watched as the implicated officials, unaware of their impending exposure, delivered their hypocritical speeches, their pious pronouncements, their expressions of grief and remembrance. As the service drew to a close, Thomas took action. He stepped forward, his voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd, his presence commanding attention. "I have something to say," he announced, his voice clear and strong. "Something that needs to be said. Something that these gentlemen would prefer to remain hidden." The crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on Thomas, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The implicated officials, their faces paling, their eyes darting nervously, shifted uneasily in their seats. Thomas began to speak, his voice filled with righteous anger, his words cutting through the silence like a knife. He revealed the conspiracy, the betrayal, the treachery of Worthington and his accomplices. He named names, he presented evidence, he exposed their crimes to the world. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The crowd erupted in a cacophony of gasps, shouts, accusations, denials. The implicated officials, their faces contorted with rage and fear, attempted to silence Thomas, to deny the charges, to discredit him. But it was too late. The truth was out. The journalist, who had been present at the service, had already sent the story to his newspaper. The presses were rolling. The news was spreading like wildfire. Chaos erupted in the church. The police arrived, arresting the implicated officials, attempting to restore order. The crowd, divided between disbelief and outrage, surged forward, demanding answers, demanding justice. Rose, standing beside Thomas, watched as the scene unfolded, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind reeling with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. They had done it. They had exposed the traitors. They had brought them to justice. But amidst the chaos, amidst the triumph, there was a lingering sense of unease, of unfinished business. Thomas knew that the conspiracy was not yet fully dismantled, that there were still powerful forces at work, forces that would stop at nothing to protect their interests. As they were leaving the church, amidst the swirling crowd, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Du Bois, the menacing stranger who had visited them at their cottage. He held a pistol, his eyes filled with hatred, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You should have stayed silent," Du Bois hissed, his voice barely audible above the din. Before he could fire, a shot rang out. Du Bois crumpled to the ground, his body lifeless. The shot had come from behind them. Rose and Thomas turned, their eyes widening in surprise. Standing there, holding a smoking pistol, was Madame Evangeline, the flamboyant medium who had helped Rose connect with Thomas's spirit. "I couldn't let him harm you," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "You have done too much good. You have brought justice to the world." She smiled, a mysterious, enigmatic smile. "Sometimes," she said, "the spirits intervene in unexpected ways." She disappeared into the crowd, leaving Rose and Thomas standing there, stunned, bewildered, and grateful. The chapel, the confession, the spirits, all aligned. A reckoning, at last. And Madame Evangeline vanished into the throngs as quickly as she appeared. Chapter 18. The Weight of the Past. The aftermath of the church confrontation brought a semblance of closure, but it also unearthed a new set of challenges. The implicated French officials were arrested, their careers ruined, their reputations shattered. Worthington, facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence, finally confessed, revealing the full extent of his conspiracy and implicating several high-ranking figures in the United States and Great Britain. The world was reeling from the revelations, the scale of the betrayal, the audacity of the traitors. Governments were shaken, alliances were tested, and the public's trust in their leaders was severely eroded. Rose and Thomas, though hailed as heroes, found themselves caught in the crosshairs of political maneuvering and media scrutiny. They were inundated with requests for interviews, offers of book deals, and invitations to speak at public events. They politely declined, seeking refuge in their quiet cottage, desperately trying to reclaim their privacy, their peace, their lives. But the weight of the past, the trauma they had endured, the secrets they had uncovered, continued to haunt them. Rose struggled with nightmares, flashbacks, and bouts of anxiety. She found it difficult to trust, to relax, to believe that the danger was truly over. Thomas, though outwardly strong and resilient, carried his own burden of guilt and regret. He blamed himself for putting Rose in danger, for exposing her to the horrors of the conspiracy, for disrupting her life. He questioned his decisions, his actions, his choices, wondering if he could have done things differently, if he could have protected her better. Their relationship, though strengthened by their shared ordeal, was strained by the unspoken tension, the unresolved issues, the lingering fear. They loved each other deeply, but they struggled to communicate, to connect, to bridge the gap that had formed between them. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, Rose finally broke the silence. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't keep going on like this." Thomas nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and apprehension.
I know, he said.
I've been distant.
I'm sorry.
It's not your fault, Rose replied. It's everything. The war, the conspiracy, the lies, the betrayals, it's all too much. They talked for hours, pouring out their hearts, sharing their fears, their doubts, their insecurities. They talked about the past, about the present, about the future. They talked about their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations. Thomas confessed his guilt, his regret, his fear of losing her. Rose confessed her anxiety, her nightmares, her struggle to trust. They realized that they needed help, that they couldn't overcome the trauma on their own. They decided to seek professional counseling, to work through their issues, to heal together. They found a therapist, a kind, compassionate woman who specialized in treating veterans and their families. They began attending regular sessions, individually and together, slowly unraveling the tangled web of their emotions, their experiences, their fears. The therapy was difficult, painful, challenging, but it was also liberating, empowering, transformative. They learned to communicate more effectively, to express their feelings more openly, to support each other more fully. They learned to forgive themselves, to forgive each other, to forgive the past. They learned to trust again, to hope again, to love again. They began to heal, to rebuild, to reclaim their lives. The weight of the past did not disappear entirely, but it became lighter, less burdensome, less overwhelming. It was a scar, a reminder of what they had endured, but also a testament to their resilience, their strength, their love. They faced the fire. They faced each other. And slowly, painfully, began to release. Everything, the weight, began to lift. Chapter 19. Redemption in the Rain. As they continued their therapy and their healing journey, Rose and Thomas decided to take a trip. They wanted to revisit the places that held significance for them, to confront the ghosts of the past, to create new memories, to solidify their bond. They started in Washington, D.C., a city that held both painful and triumphant memories. They visited the Lincoln Memorial, where Rose had first seen the phantom shadow, the trigger for her incredible journey. They stood before the imposing statue, gazing up at Lincoln's somber face, reflecting on the burdens of leadership, the sacrifices of war, the enduring power of hope. They visited the War Department building, where they had uncovered the crucial evidence, where they had faced Fitzwilliam, where their lives had been forever changed. They walked through the silent corridors, the echoes of the past whispering around them, a reminder of the danger they had faced, the courage they had shown. They visited Arlington National Cemetery, where so many soldiers, victims of the war, were laid to rest. They stood before the tomb of the unknown soldier, paying their respects, honoring the fallen, remembering the sacrifices that had been made. But they also created new memories, positive memories, to counter the darkness of the past. They visited the National Gallery of Art, where they had first encountered Fairchild, the traitor who had almost destroyed them. They stood before the Monet painting, the water lilies shimmering in the light, a symbol of beauty, of resilience, of hope. They walked along the Potomac River, hand in hand, enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company, the warmth of the sun on their faces, the gentle breeze in their hair. From Washington, they traveled to London, where Rose had worked as a nurse during the war. They visited the hospital where she had tended to the wounded, where she had witnessed so much suffering, where she had found her strength, her compassion, her purpose. They walked through the streets of London, exploring the city, discovering its hidden corners, its vibrant culture, its enduring spirit. They visited the British Museum, the National Portrait Gallery, the Houses of Parliament, immersing themselves in the history, the art, the politics of the country that had been both an ally and a source of betrayal. And then, one evening, as they were walking along the Thames River, it began to rain. A soft, gentle rain, a cleansing rain, a healing rain. They stood there, under the shelter of a bridge, watching the rain fall on the river, listening to the rhythmic drumming on the stone arches. Thomas turned to Rose, his eyes filled with love, with tenderness, with gratitude. "I love you, Rose," he said, his voice soft but clear. "I love you more than words can say." Rose smiled, her eyes shining with tears, Tears of joy, tears of relief, tears of love. "I love you too, Thomas," she replied. "More than anything in the world." They embraced a long, tight embrace, a reunion of two souls who had been through so much, who had endured so much, who had found their way back to each other. The rain continued to fall, washing away the dirt, the grime, the pain of the past, leaving behind a sense of peace, of renewal, of hope. It was a redemption, a cleansing, a new beginning. They knew that the scars of the past would always be there, a reminder of what they had endured, but they also knew that they were stronger, more resilient, more in love than ever before. They had faced the darkness, and they had emerged, together, into the light. The rain fell. They held each other, and, in that moment, found complete redemption. Chapter 20. A new dawn, a new shadow. After their travels, Rose and Thomas returned to their cottage in France, their hearts filled with a renewed sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of themselves, and a stronger bond than ever before. They had confronted the ghosts of the past, made peace with their demons, and embraced the possibility of a brighter future. They decided to dedicate their lives to helping others, to using their experiences to make a difference in the world. Thomas, with his military background and his understanding of international affairs, became involved in efforts to promote peace and prevent future conflicts. He worked with veterans organizations, advocating for better care and support for those who had served their countries. Rose, with her nursing experience and her compassionate heart, focused on providing medical care and emotional support to those in need. She volunteered at a local clinic, assisting the village doctor and providing care to the sick and injured. She also established a small support group for women who had suffered trauma, offering them a safe space to share their stories, to heal, to rebuild their lives. They became pillars of their community, respected and admired for their courage, their resilience, their generosity. They were known for their quiet strength, their unwavering commitment to justice, and their deep love for each other. Years passed, and their life settled into a comfortable rhythm. They continued their work, their travels, their commitment to each other. They never forgot the past, the lessons they had learned, the sacrifices they had made, but they no longer allowed it to define them, to control them, to haunt them. One crisp autumn morning, as Rose was walking through the village market, she noticed something familiar. A shadow. A tall, broad-shouldered shadow, cast by the morning sun. She stopped, her heart skipping a beat, her mind flashing back to that night in Washington, to the phantom shadow that had started it all. She turned, her eyes searching the crowd, her senses on high alert. Was it him? Was it Worthington? Had he somehow escaped? Had he come back to seek revenge? But it wasn't Worthington. It was a young man, a soldier, wearing the uniform of the French army. He was walking with a slight limp, his face bearing the scars of a recent battle. Rose approached him, her heart filled with a mixture of compassion and concern. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice gentle. The young man looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. "Yes, madam," he replied. I am recovering." Rose introduced herself, offering her assistance, inviting him to her cottage for tea and conversation. The young man, whose name was Jean-Pierre, accepted her offer, grateful for her kindness, her understanding. As they talked, Rose learned that Jean-Pierre had been injured in a recent skirmish, that he had lost many of his comrades, that he was struggling to cope with the trauma, the grief, the loss. Rose listened patiently, offering words of comfort, of support, of hope. She shared her own experiences, her own struggles, her own journey of healing. She realized that the shadow she had seen was not a ghost from the past, but a reflection of the present, a reminder that the world was still a dangerous place, that there were still battles to be fought, that there were still wounds to be healed. She and Thomas welcomed Jean-Pierre into their lives, offering him friendship, guidance, and support. They helped him to recover, to rebuild his life, to find his purpose. And as they watched Jean-Pierre grow stronger, more resilient, more hopeful, they realized that their own journey had come full circle. They had started with a shadow, a ghost from the past, and they had ended with a shadow, a reflection of the future. A future filled with hope, with healing, with love. A future where the new dawn might cast a shadow, but they would be there to provide the light. Rose and Thomas looked at each other. Their journey was complete. The sun rose. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the enduring power of love and resilience. Rose and Thomas continued their work, their travels, their commitment to each other, and to making the world a better place. They became grandparents, their cottage filled with the laughter of children and the warmth of family. Jean-Pierre, fully recovered and inspired by their example, dedicated his life to public service, eventually becoming a respected leader in his community, advocating for peace and justice. He never forgot the kindness and support that Rose and Thomas had shown him, and he remained a close friend of the family for the rest of his days. The story of Rose and Thomas, the shadow that wasn't hers, the conspiracy, the betrayal, the redemption, became a legend, whispered in the corridors of power, recounted in history books, and celebrated in popular culture. But for Rose and Thomas, it was simply their life, a journey of love, loss, courage, and healing. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch of their cottage, watching the sunset over the lavender fields, Rose turned to Thomas, her eyes filled with a lifetime of love and gratitude. "Remember that night in Washington?" she asked, her voice soft and wistful. "The night I saw the shadow?" Thomas smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his hand reaching for hers. "How could I forget?" he replied. "It was the beginning of everything." "It was a terrifying time," Rose said. "But it also brought us together. It showed us what we were capable of, what we could overcome." "It did," Thomas agreed. "It showed us the strength of our love, the power of our bond." They sat in silence for a moment, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with peace and contentment. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, painting the sky in hues of orange, purple, and gold. Rose looked at Thomas, her eyes shining with a love that had endured the test of time, a love that had conquered all obstacles, a love that had defied death itself. "It wasn't a shadow, you know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It was ours. A shadow of our future, of our destiny, of our love." Thomas nodded, his eyes meeting hers, his heart overflowing with gratitude for the woman who had stood by him through it all, the woman who had been his rock, his anchor, his soulmate, the woman who he would never have met. The shadows lengthened, the darkness deepened, but Rose and Thomas were not afraid. They had each other. They had their love. They had their life. And that was all that mattered. Their hands, intertwined, held a lifetime. And the shadows were finally gone.